Today's shir is dedicated in honor of Le'ilu Nishmas Yecheved Bas Matisyahu, and in truth, all the shiurim of this week were dedicated in her honor. I just forgot to mention it on the earlier days, but I'm mentioning it today on Thursday. Her yahrzeit was on Monday, and all the Torah that we've been learning should be Le'ilu Nishmasa. May her neshama have an aliyah, and may we all be zeicha. May we all be zeicha to merit in her honor to learn Torah Lishma, and that our Torah should be accepted in the eyes of Hashem. Okay. Yeah. Now, there are a few things we need to catch up on from yesterday. The first thing I want to cover is the issue that we asked about the tzidei tzedadim of the behema, the side of the animal, which we said that the shvus of the chachamim, which means a rabbinical prohibition on Shabbos of using an animal, was something that was connected to riding the animal. And therefore we say you cannot use an animal in any way on Yom Tov because of that. However, the question was whether that only refers to the back of the animal, or does it also include the sides of the animal and the head of the animal. And we decided that it includes the side of the animal, it includes the head of the animal, but we said the sides of the sides, which means if something was connected to the side of the animal, then you can use that side for your own benefit on Shabbos or Yom Tov. The question we had was, what about a saddlebag? Can you use a saddlebag on Yom Tov? And we don't mean to put something in it, but we're talking about to lean on the side or something. So Shulchan Aruch actually deals with this question directly, and that's what I'm going to post over here. Oh, I should make this a bit smaller, otherwise I'm not going to be able to see. Okay, do it like this. Okay, so 1 second. Okay, there you go. A bit bigger. So this is in Shin Hey 305 in Orach Chaim. This is the Shulchan Aruch Harav, but it's also brought down in the Mishnah Berurah. But it was easier to pull this one up. So I'm just going to read in English. One may not ride on an animal on Shabbos, nor may one hang on it, nor lean on it, because it is forbidden to make use of an animal in any manner. The rationale is that our sages included making use of an animal in any way in their decree against riding, which they forbade, lest one cut off a branch from a tree connected to the earth to direct the animal he is riding. It is even forbidden to use the sides of an animal, for example, to rub a child against the side of an animal's back to give the child pleasure, or to use the animal's side for support. It is, however, permitted to make use of the sides of its sides. What does that mean? So he gives an example. When something else is placed on the side of the animal's back or placed on the side of other portions of its body, a person may then make use of the sides of that entity, so like the saddleback. It is, however, forbidden to perform a function directly on top of the entity that is placed on the side of the animal, because that is considered as actually making use of the animal's side. Does that make sense? So there's an interesting halacha that comes out as a result of this, and that is, if we keep reading, it says, accordingly, when an animal is pulling or drawing a wagon inside a town's Shabbos limits, it is forbidden to enter the wagon even though a non-Jew is leading the animal. In other words, a Jew's not allowed to lead the animal, that's for sure, right? Because that's forbidden. But what about the wagon, right, that is attached to it? He says you're not allowed to enter on that wagon. Why? Because the rationale is that the staves of the wagon are connected to the sides of the animal, and the staves and the wagon are deemed a single entity. So it's not the tzidei tzedadim, it's not the side of the side, it's on top of the side. So one who enters the wagon is thus using an entity placed on the sides of the animal, and license was granted only to use the sides of an entity attached to the sides of an animal. So and then he makes another point about, it's also forbidden to sit on the boards that juts out from the back of the wagon. So, because that might be something connected to it, to something that's connected. Because at the end of the day, we say anything that's attached to it, right? If you can only use it from the side, not on top of it, because that would be considered as if you are using the actual animal on top of the animal. So that's the answer to that. You can lean on it from the side, but you cannot hang on it or use it in a way that you're sitting on the thing which is on the side of the animal. So that's the end of that issue. I'm happy to discuss it more if anybody has any comments or questions about it.
I have a question.
Yes.
It makes even less sense to me, the explanation that I just heard about side of a side.
Okay.
Since there is a prohibition to put anything on the top of the animal, on the back of the animal, here you are saying you are allowed to put something on the back of the animal, and the things that hang off to the side are not attached to the side of the animal, they are side of the side that you can use. So how do you transgress the issue on putting something on the back of the animal?
Right, so that's a good question. It must be that we're talking about that the saddlebag is already there before Shabbos. And the question is, you're walking down the street and you need something to support you for a minute, and you see a saddlebag. So you want to just put your hand on the saddlebag so that you can adjust your shoe or something, right? So putting your hand on the saddlebag, on the side of the saddlebag, that's okay. But to hang on it, right, to sit on top of the saddlebag or something like of that nature, or to put something in the saddlebag if there's an Eruv or something, that would be forbidden, because that would be considered as to being on top. But you're right, you wouldn't be able to place it in such a way that it should hang from the side so that then you could use it, because that would be using the animal. So it must be that it was already there from before Shabbos. The question is, can you put your hand against it?
But an animal doesn't have the settle all night, 24 hours a day. The settle is something you put on when you're going to use it.
Oh, so maybe we're talking about a non-Jew's animal. So the non-Jew is allowed to put the saddle on, and you're walking down the street.
Yeah, maybe. And a guy would allow on his animal.
Right, no, but what I'm saying is you're walking down the street and you bump into your friend who's not Jewish, who has an animal, who has a saddlebag on it, and you want to know, can I put my hand against it or not?
Yeah.
Yes.
Rabbi, I'd just like to ask one question.
Yeah.
So we define the sides of the side, not integral to the animal, but like you say, a saddle or something else that's been placed upon the side of an animal.
Correct. I mean, anything
so
that
there's no actual side of a side that we can define as that being integral to the animal. It's something that is artificial on it.
Right. The point is that it's not the animal itself.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure
it's actually
that
on
was
the back of the
confusing.
animal. It's actually on the back of the animal.
That is true. It's attached to it, but it's hanging from the side. And what you're doing is you're not touching the animal itself. You're touching something that is attached to its side.
Well, yeah, it's the same thing of when you pour coffee in a cup on Shabbos, okay? You got to use it. It's an intermediary, but it's still something you can do because you're not dealing with a living creature.
I'm not sure I see the direct link.
Well, I'm just trying to.
Yeah,
no. So essentially, you can put hot water in one cup and then pour it in another cup to drink from. You can't do it directly from the urn.
But that's for.
I know it's a different reason,
right.
But it's the same kind of dynamic.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. I'm just wondering whether there was anything else I wanted to discuss.
The difference is you are allowed to pour the water, but you're not allowed to drink it. So
directly from
It's a different issue.
Right. No, the point is he's making a comparison with this idea of a step away.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
So I get it. Okay. There's another thing that we touched upon, but I didn't really address it properly, and I wanted to go back and just kind of explain that there's a machlekes between Rashi and Tosfos how to understand the different things that we say about Shmini Atzeres, that it's a separate Yom Tov. Okay, we said that there was a mnemonic to remember what the different things were. Right? It's Pei, Shin, Reish, and then you'd have Kuf, Shin, and Base. And Rashi has one opinion as to what these all refer to, and Tosfos agrees with many of them, but has just one or two variants. So I just want to go through what they are, just because it's interesting. And if so, it could be people already know, and if you know, you can stop me now, and we can just move on. But if for those who don't know, it's worthwhile going through. It's just it's just interesting, and it comes up in a few places in Shas, so that's why it's just worth going through them. So the first one is what's called pious. A pious is a lottery. Now, let me explain how this works. In the time of the Beis Hamikdash, there were what's called 24 groups, right, or guards, right, of Kohanim. Like there were groups of families of Kohanim that would get a special chance to do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, and they would get certain times during the year where just that mishmar, just that guard, right, would just that group would do the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. However, when it came to Yom Tov, all 24 would take part in the avodah in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, when it comes to splitting it up equally, right, we have 70 karbanos that were brought up special for Sukkos, right? Each day you'd go down, right, until ultimately it all totaled 70 different sacrifices. Now, anybody who's good in division knows that 70 doesn't go into 24, like evenly. If we had 72, then everybody would get three karbanos each. So each mishmar would have 3 karbanos during the course of Yom Tov. However, since we only have 70, so what you have is like this. You have 66 karbanos, right, are being divided by 22 families. That goes equally, right? However, then you have another 4 to make up the 70, which is going to be divided by the remaining 2 families, because we said there's 24 groups, right? So those 2 are only going to bring up 2 karbanos each. Okay, so now the thought is maybe the par echad and the ayil echad, right? The one bull and the one ram that were brought up on Shmini Atzeres, just give it to those 2, and then it works perfect, right? If you include the karbanos of Shmini Atzeres, instead of it being 70, you got 72, and then if you have 72, then everybody gets equal. So comes along this idea of the pious, the goyrel, to tell me that Shmini Atzeres is a separate Yom Tov, and so therefore there's a new goyrel that happens between all 24 groups. The fact that the goyrel from Sukkot fell out, that 2 groups missed out on having a 3rd carbon to offer, doesn't automatically give them the right to get one of the 2 that were left over that are on Shmini Atzeres. And that's the idea of regel b'fnei atzmahu. Don't mix the 2. One is Sukkos and the other Shmini Atzeres. That's the first thing. Okay, Rashi and Tosfos agree on that. Then the second thing is about Shehechianu, right? That on Shmini Atzeres, unlike the last day of the Yom Tov of Pesach, we say a Shehechianu, and the reason why we say a Shehechianu is because it's a separate Yom Tov. The last day of Pesach is not a separate Yom Tov. It's the same Yom Tov. And so therefore we don't make another Shehechianu, right? Whereas Shmini Atzeres make a special Shehechianu. Now, the next one is Regel. Regel means that it's, according to Rashi, Regel means that we say B'yom Shmini Atzeres, right? That Shmini Atzeres has its own name. It's not called Sukkos. Whereas Pesach is called Pesach, Shavuos is called Shavuos. Well, it's only one day, but Sukkos is one Yom Tov, Shmini Atzeres is a separate Yom Tov. Tosfos disagrees, and Tosfos says that no, Regel here refers to the obligation to stay over an extra day, right? In other words, when you come to Yerushalayim, if you're there for Yom Tov, you cannot leave on the eve after. You've got to wait till the next morning. And he says that applies to Shmini Atzeres as well. And we had that in the Gemara, this idea of sleeping over Yerushalayim an extra day. So that's one machlekes. The next thing is the Karban, and the Karban was as follows: that each one of the days of Sukkot, you had the Karbanos that were brought up. First you had 13, and then you had 12, then 11, then 10, and so on, right? And in addition to those Karbanos, you had the 14 lambs, and then you had the 2 rams that were brought up every day. Whereas when it comes to Shmini Atzeres, right? Shmini Atzeres was different in that it didn't follow that order at all. It was just the Par Echad and the Ayel Echad that were brought up, because it's a separate Yom Tov, so it didn't follow in the manner of the Karbanos that were being brought up until then. So that's the other issue that makes Shmini Atzeres a Yom Tov on its own. And then what was the other thing was Shir. Now, according to Rashi, Shir means that every day you have a special song that they would sing in the Beis Hamikdash, which is discussed in the Gemara Sukkos Daf Nun Hey, and it goes through the different things that were read. Shmini Atzeres, there was a special song just for that day, and Rashi says we don't know what it was. In other words, it's not explicitly stated. However, Tosfos brings that it's brought down somewhere that it was Lamnatzech ala Shminis. It was one of the Tehillims that starts Lamnatzech ala Shminis. And then the final one is the bracha, and that's the base. The bracha, according to Rashi, refers to the blessing that the people gave to the king, as it says in the book of Malachim, where when Shlomo HaMelech brought everybody together, then after Shmini Atzeres, he sent everybody home, and they blessed him before they left. So that was connected with Shmini Atzeres. Whereas Tosfos says that no, it's actually bracha over here in the Gemara is referring to Ya Levi Yavai. That when you say Ya Levi Yavai in benching, right, or when you say it in Shemona Esrei, right, Ya Levi Yavai has a special name for Shmini Atzeres, separate from Sukkot. So those are the things that we mentioned yesterday. I mentioned them yesterday in passing, but I just wanted to go through all of them. That was that. And was there anything else that I wanted to address? I think that's it. Other things might come up as we learn the Gemara further, but that's it for now. Okay. So as I said before, the learning today is Leilul Nishmas Yocheved Bas Matisyahu, and we're going to start from Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, and we're starting from Toshema Mishaloi Chog Shivas Yemei HaPesach. This is Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis, 17b2 in the Art Scroll, 17b2 in the Art Scroll, and it is just the last line of the small lines on Daf Yud Zayin Amud Beis. Everybody have it? Okay, yeah. Let's do it. Zog the Heilige Gemara. We're going to try and refute what Rabbi Oshia said. What did Rabbi Oshia said? Rabbi Oshia said that just like the first day, just like the Yom Tov of Pesach has Tashlumin, which means that if you weren't able to bring up your Karban, you were able to bring it up all the rest of the days of Yom Tov. So too, when it comes to Shavuos, even though it's only one day Yom Tov, you still have 7 days to be able to, you still have 7 days to come and fulfill that obligation and bring up that Karban. So now we're trying to refute this and say, maybe not. Toshema, come and learn. It says in the Brisa, Mi sheloi chog shivas yimei haPesach, somebody who didn't offer up his Talmud Chagiga during the 7 days of Pesach, Ushmonis me'achag, or the 8 days of Sukkos. V'yom Ta'iv Shel Atzeres, or on the Yom Tov of Sukkos, Shuv and Chagig. Then he can no longer bring up the Korban Chagiga. So what do we have? We have simple Pesach. The whole Yom Tov you can bring it up, but that's got 7 days, right? So that includes the days of Tashlumin. When we talk about Sukkos, it says all 8 days of Sukkos, but after that you can't bring it up. That's fine for Sukkos because it has those 8 days to complete it. But when this Brisa mentions Shavuos, it says if you didn't bring it up on Shavuos, right, then you can't bring it up anymore. So this is seemingly a refutation to Reb Oisha. My love, does this Brisa not mean that Yom Tov Shel Atzeres, it's only on the Yom Tov of Atzeres that you can bring it up, and you cannot bring it up after the Yom Tov of Atzeres? That's what Shuvei Nechayik means. He's no longer able to bring it up. So therefore, it seems that there's no Tashlumin, there's no way to compensate and bring up after Yom Tov of Shavuos. And for the Gemara, no. When it says the Yom Tov Shel Atzeres, it means Yom Tavoyach. How did this come about? It's possible, right, that there was an abbreviation, right? An abbreviation for Yom Tov is Yud, Vav, Tov. That's how you abbreviate Yom Tov. Now, because it says Yud and a Vav and a Tov, you could read that abbreviation 2 ways. You could either read it as Yom Tov, or you could read it as Yom Tavoyach. Okay, so instead of reading the Brisa as saying that the Yom Tov Shel Atzeres, right, if you didn't bring it up on the Yom Tov of Atzeres, then you can't bring it up anymore, right? So don't read it Yom Tov, but read it Yom Tavoyach. And if you amend the Brisa to be read it that way, so then there is Tashlumin. Right, the Gemara, 1 second. If so, so then let's learn from this that there's only 1 day, which is the Yom Tavayach, which is to be used for a compensation, but there's no 7 days like the others. And for the Gemara, no, Ema, you've got to change it, and you have to say that it doesn't say Yom Tavayach, but it says Yemei Tavayach, the days of slaughter, which means there are actually a full week given to you to be able to do the tashlumin if you didn't bring up the karbanos. And this way, it's not a refutation of Reb Oishia. Yeah, from the Gemara. 1 second. I'm going to try again to refute Reb Oishia. Why? Very interesting. Toshima, come and learn. It says, the Tony Rabbi Bashmul says, Omra Torah, the Torah says, Menei Yomim v'Kadesh Chodesh. You should count days, which means count 30 days, and then you should sanctify the beginning of the new month. And L'may nafka, why do we care when the new month is? When Yom Tov falls aside, there's something special about Rosh Chodesh itself, and that is there are extra karbanos that are brought up on Rosh Chodesh, the Korban Musaf, right? So if you have the Korban Musaf, right? So we're told to count days, 30 days, and then you're going to sanctify the new month, and then you're going to bring karbanos. And then it says also that how do we get to Shavuos? The only way we get to Shavuos is not because it falls out on a particular day of a particular month, preordained by the Torah, but rather the Torah tells us, right, that you should count 50 days. So count days and then be Mekadesh Atzeres, which means you're going to bring the offerings, you're going to bring the karbanos of Shavuos. So now here's the teaching. Just like the month, the beginning of the month, which is sanctified for how long? It's only sanctified for 1 day, right? What does that mean? It's 1 unit of the things that you use to get to it. How do you get to the next month? 30 days. So we use the unit used to count to get there as we use one of them to designate as the day we bring up these offerings, which is Rosh Chodesh alone. So maybe we should also say that Af Atzeres Limenuyah, that so too when it comes to Shavuos, how do you get to Shavuos? You count 50 days. So take 1 day of those days, right? Meaning take that unit of a day, and just like Rosh Chodesh, you only bring up a korban on the day of Rosh Chodesh itself, so too, you should only bring up a korban on the day of Shavuos itself. That's, in other words, I've already said what the Gemara is trying to say. So my love, Gorma Chodesh, so then why not extrapolate from Chodesh Ma, Chodesh Yom Echad, just like Chodesh, meaning Rosh Chodesh is one day, Afatzeres Yom Echad. So too, Shavuos is only one day, and you'd only bring karbanos for one day. Therefore, there'd be no tashlumin. That would seemingly be a refutation of Reb Oishia. Yeah, understand the question? We're trying to compare Rosh Chodesh to Atzeres, right? Because both of them come as a result of instructions to count days, and just like for Rosh Chodesh, you count one day and you use that unit of a day for the karbanos, so too you should do the same for Shavuos. And for the Gemara, Amar Rava says, "V'tizbra." Does that really make sense to compare the two? You can't compare the two. Why? Because Atu Atzeres Yeme Maninan Shavuye Loy Maninan. Is it the case that when it comes to Shavuos, we only count days? When it comes to Rosh Chodesh, we only count 30 days. That's it, right? Because that's what we're told to do. However, when it comes to Shavuos, we're not just told to count days. We're also told to count weeks. Didn't Abaye already say that mitzvah lemimne yema, that there's a mitzvah to count the days? How do we know there's a mitzvah to count the days between Pesach and Shavuos? It says count 50 days. Mitzvah lemimne shavuye, but Abaye also says that it's a mitzvah to count the weeks. How do we know? As it's written, Shiva Shavuos tisbalach. You shall count 7 weeks for yourself. So we've got 7 weeks and we've got the 50 days. So now, if that's the case, if you want to try and compare it to Rosh Chodesh only has days, right? Whereas when it comes to Shavuos, we also have weeks. So you can't compare it to Rosh Chodesh. And not just that, furthermore, the Oid Chag Shavuos Ksiv, it's called a festival of weeks. That's what it's called, a festival of weeks. If that's what it's being called, so certainly we should use that unit, right, to apply to its karbanos, and so therefore, ultimately, you still have a week for tashlumin if you didn't bring it up on Shavuos, and so therefore, Reb Oshia's position still stands, right? Okay, so now says the Gemara, we're going to bring a new source that you can have a hashlama, you can have tashlumin for Shavuos. So the Bay Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, Tano, the Academy of Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, they taught as follows. I want to just bring up over here the psukim so that we can look at the psukim because it doesn't bring it down in full. So not this one, but this one. Okay, you see it? Everybody see it? Yeah.
Yes.
So this is in Vayikra Chav Gimel, where it talks about all the Yom Tevim, and so we get to the Yom Tov of Shavuot, where it says, "Usfartem lechem imachas Shabbos." You count from the day after Shabbos. For bringing up the wave offering, Sheva Shabbos is to Tiena. You should count 7 complete weeks, and then it goes on to say, Shabbos right? You're going to count 50 days, and then you bring up the Omer. Now, if we scroll down to Pasuk Chav Aleph, right? After he starts mentioning what should be done on that day, it says about the day of Shavuos, it says, Ukrosem be'etzem hayom hazeh mikra kodesh yelachem, right? On this day, you're going to designate it as a holy occasion, right? And it's going to be, and you're not going to be able to do any avodah on this day. Right after that, the very next verse, it says, right? And when you reap the harvest of your land, he tells us about leaving leket, shikha, and peya, etc. You got to leave it over for the aniyim, right? But it seems, right, that these two psukim are put together, that at the time where you call Shavuos a day, a holy day for Hashem, right? It says that you can reap the harvest of your land. And now let's go and look into the Gemara and see how the Gemara wants to use the juxtaposition of these two psukim to teach me that we've got to be talking about 7 days of Tashlumin. And I'll show you how it all works. Let's learn it inside together in the Gemara. So he says like this. He says, O Makro, it says in the Pasuk, Ukrosem, Uvekutzrechem. So these two psukim that we just mentioned, Pasuk, was it Chaf Aleph and Chaf Beis, are put together. One talks about having a holy day, a Yom Tov, where you're not allowed to do any malacha. And the next pasuk says, Uvekutzrechem. So now, Eze Chag Sha'ato Kirei, V'koitzer Boi, which Yom Tov do you have? On the one hand, a Mikra Kodesh, you're calling it a holy day. And at the same time, you can reap. Have Omer, we must say that this is what? That this is Chag Atzeres, it's the day of Shavuot, the Yom Tov of Shavuos. Now, 1 second. Emas, when is this on Shavuos? When exactly can you have a Mikra Kodesh and do Ktsira reaping, which is a malacha on Shabbos and a malacha on Yom Tov? So he says, maybe Yom Tov. If you're going to say it's actually on Yom Tov itself, that's not possible. Ktsira b'Yom Tov Mishari, is it possible? Are you allowed to reap on Yom Tov? So then, what do you have to say it is? Uvekutzrechem, right? This idea of reaping is not talking about on Shavuos itself, elalav l'tashlumin. Rather, you're going to have to say that this is referring to the tashlumin. This is referring to the compensation of bringing up all these sacrifices. And during those days, you're allowed to do ketira. You're allowed to reap. Yeah, you understand? You understand the svara? We're learning out from the fact that you have these two things together. You're still having the kutzrechem during Yom Tov, but it's not really Yom Tov because Shavuos is already over, right? However, why is it still considered Yom Tov in a certain sense? It's still considered Yom Tov in a certain sense because you can still bring up the karbanos. And like I mentioned yesterday, this is the idea of why we don't say Tachnun until Yud Gimel, right? Because of the Yemei Tashlumin, because it's still, in a sense, connected to the Yom Tov of Shavuos. Okay? The problem we have is, why do I need two limudim? Why do I need to have two sources to learn out the same thing? We brought from Reb Oishia. Reb Oishia says very simple. It says, Chaga Matzos, Chaga Shavuos, Chaga Sukkos. So that's how we know that just like Chaga Pesach has Yemei Tashlumin, so too Shavuos does. So why do I need to have another one? This whole or cross them over kutzrechem. Why do I need to have that limud? So that's what the Gemara comes to address now. The Gemara says, even though the itma that we've already learned, the Rabbi Elazar Amar Rabbi Yoshia, the teaching of Rabbi Elazar in the name of Rabbi Yoshia, nevertheless, it's the Rabbi Elazar Bar Yaakov. I still need this extra one from Elazar Bar Yaakov. Why? Why do I need to have both? So he explains why I need to have both. If I'd only have it from Rabbi Oishia, who learned it out from where? From Pesach. So then, I might have thought that what? Just like the days that you can do the compensation for the Chagiga on Pesach. On those days, you're not allowed to do malacha, meaning to say you cannot do malacha during Chol HaMoed. And we'll see in the Gemara on Daf Yud Ches this whole idea of what you can do and what you can't do, and how do we know that you're not allowed to do any malacha, or it's very much restricted about what malacha you are able to do, and in which cases you're able to do malacha on Yom Tov. So we're going to say like this: if the only place you're going to learn out Yemei Tashlumin is from Pesach, then I might think that the days that follow Shavuos are exactly the same in terms of whether you could do malacha or not. So just like on Chol HaMoed, you're not of Pesach, you're not allowed to do, and certainly on the last day of Yom Tov, you're not allowed to do any malacha on those days. So I would say after Shlumi Atzeres, Nami Osam Basiyas Malacha. I'm going to say that during the compensation time of Shavuos, It's also you're not allowed to do any malacha. That's why Kamash Malon, the Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov. That's why you come along and teach us the brisa of Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov, who that establishes that the uvakutzrechem as kitzir artzachem, this idea of the harvesting, that it is allowed. Right, that we learn from him that these days of Tashlumin, you are allowed to do the reaping. Right, so that's why we need to have Rebbe Elazar ben Yaakov's, and it's not enough to have Rebbe Oshiy's. What about the other way around? So he says, if you're going to come along and only use the drasha of Uvakurtzachem next to Ukrosem, right, that we just mentioned, so then here we go over to Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph. It says, Lo Yadaino Kamo. Then I wouldn't know how many days of compensation there are. Why? Why? Says Rashi, Kama Yomim Yul Tashlumin Kamash Malan. One second. Why? One second. Because it says like this. When it says because if it says Uvakutzrechem right after Ukarosem, it doesn't tell me how many days this Uvakutzrechem is ongoing, right? It could be just one day. It could be like Beis Shammai says, you have a Yom Tavayach, and maybe that's all there is. Maybe there's just a Yom Tavayach, one day where you're allowed to do malacha, and it's also Yom Tov. I don't know that you have 7 days, right? That's why you need to have the drasha of Rebbe Elazar to Rebbe Oshia that comes along and tells you that we learn it also out from Pesach, and just like Pesach has 7 days, so too Shavuos has 7 days. Yeah, that's what Rashi says. Lo Yadana, look at the top Rashi on Daf Yud Ches. Lo Yadana kama yomim yiyul tashlumin. We wouldn't know how many days are for compensation because it doesn't specify in the pasuk of Uvakurtzachem Kamash Malon. So it comes to teach me the teaching of Rebbe Elazar, Ma Chag Matzos is Shiva, just like the Chag Matzos is Shiva, Akan Shiva. So too over here is also 7. Okay.
Rabbi,
yes.
Was that paskent like that because some people that needed to do the korbanot more than one day, they didn't want that those people will cause harm to everybody else that needs to cut their wheat or to work liktzor.
Right. No, here's the thing. When it comes to the Isurim of Torah, there are no real loopholes, if you know what I mean. If you are allowed to do malacha, everybody's allowed to do malacha. If you're not allowed to do malacha, no one's allowed to do malacha unless of course, it's pikuach nefesh and so on and so forth. But when it says uvakutzrechem, it tells me that the days of tashlumin, right, are not like the days of Tashlumin of Pesach, in which you cannot do malacha. The days of Tashlumin of Shavuos, since it really is no longer Shavuos, these are ordinary weekdays. And ordinary weekdays are days that you're allowed to
but
do
they have a special permit to do korbanos.
They have a special permit to do korbanos because just like Pesach has the days of Tashlumin, Shavuos also has the days of Tashlumin.
Yeah, we went over that.
But there's an interesting question that's brought up, and that is, who says you're not allowed to do Ktsira on Yom Tov? Seemingly, when it comes to Oichel Nefesh, Torah says you're allowed to do malacha, right? It says you're not allowed to do any malacha. That you can do types of avodah that are required for eating. So we know from the kneading and the dough, the kneading and the baking and so on and so forth, all of that is permitted to do on Yom Tov to eat, right?
Yeah.
However, what about reaping? So it seems like there's an Issa D'Rabbanan. It seems like there's an Issa D'Rabbanan not to do reaping on Yom Tov. And even that, it's a machlekes. However, here it seems from the Gemara that is quite obvious that reaping is not permitted on Yom Tov. It says, it says, right, one second, it says, a must be Yom Tov, right? So, Ksira be Yom Tov Mishari, it's almost like, obviously it's not permitted. So, how could that be? So, the answer that's given, how this could work, according to all opinions, is even those opinions that hold Ksira is really allowed, Minat Torah. It's really allowed to do Ksira because it's Eichel Nefesh. How much is allowed? Only the amount that you need to eat, right? Only, but here we're saying we're talking about reaping a whole field and leaving over. That would be also according to all opinions. The ketzira, the amount of a whole field which you don't need to eat on that day, that is according to everybody also. Just an interesting observation.
Yeah, but that's what I thought, that it's just not to cause harm to the people that need to cut.
No. What I'm saying is, what I'm saying is, l'ch'ora, you could think that when it says uktzartem k'tzir artzachem, it's referring to the day of Shavuos itself. Why? Because perhaps on Shavuos itself it's permitted to do k'tzira because it's for eichel nefesh. Why do you assume automatically that it can't be talking about Shavuos because the melacha of k'tzira would be forbidden on Shavuos? Who says? Maybe it's not. So the answer is that certainly whatever the pasuk is referring to would be forbidden according to all opinions on the Yom Tov of Shavuos. Why? Because you're talking about reaping a whole field, and that would for sure be forbidden on Yom Tov. Therefore, the Ukutzartem has to be talking about the days following Shavuos, not Shavuos itself.
Yeah. No, I'm just talking the days after Shavuos. It would cause difficulty for some people that need to cut their food,
I understand that, but it's not that the rabbis allowed Ketzira. It's that the Torah never forbade Ketzira after the Yom Tov Shavuos. It's just we extended the days that you could bring Tashlumin, and it's not really a Yom Tov.
Okay, yeah, I understand that, all of that.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so now for this idea of there being Tashlumin, we're going to bring another proof from Reish Lakish. Now, this proof that Reish Lakish brings, Rabbi Yechanan is obviously going to ask a question on Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan, were two major, nemesis. But they really, it's I enjoy the, if you know the story behind Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan, every time you see a machlekes in Shas with them, you just smile. Does everybody know the story of Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan? Reish Lakish was a bandit. He was a highway robber, right? And what happened was, he one day saw Rabbi Yechanan, and from the distance, he thought that this was a beautiful woman because Rabbi Yechanan was so beautiful. His face shone. But when he
jumped over the river.
That's right. He jumped over. And he got there in like 3 springs or whatever it was, and when he came up close, he saw that Rabbi Yechanan's a man. He's like, such beauty should be given to a woman who should be wasted on a man. And Rabbi Yechanan responded to him, such strength should be given to the Torah and not to something else. And he says, but you know what? I have a sister that's even more beautiful than I am, and if you do tshuva and come and learn, then you can marry my sister. And that's exactly what happened. He did tshuva, and he married his sister, and he became one of the greatest teachers of Torah. So every time they have an argument in Shas, I smile. Anyway, so here's the machlekes between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yechanan. Or well, not so much a machlekes, but a challenge. So Reish Lakish comes along and says, you know where we're going to learn out that Shavuos has Tashlumin? We'll learn it from him. Reish Lakish says in the pasuk, V'chag HaKotzir, the festival of the harvest, right? That's what Shavuos is called. Shavuos is called Chag HaKotzir, right? This is in Shema, this is in Shemais, right? It says 23:16. So it says over there, Chag HaKotzir, right? So, what festival is it that you bring on the one hand the Chagiga, And on the other hand, you reap the harvest. We should say that this is actually Atzeres. Now, when exactly on Atzeres? Eimas. When is it going to be? When are you going to say that you have the Chagiga and you reap? If you're going to say it's by Yom Tov, which is very similar to what we just said, or almost the same. If you're going to say that it's on Yom Tov, can't be. Why? Because Ktsira be Yom Tov Mishari. Is reaping permitted on Yom Tov? It's not. Elalav, rather, it has to be what? L'tashlumin. The whole idea is that we're calling it Chag HaKotzir. The Chag part goes on the Karban Chagiga that's brought on Shavuos. And the Kotzir is referring to the days afterwards when you can bring Tashlumin and you can still do the Malacha of Ktsira. So Rabbi Yochanan doesn't like this. So Rabbi Yochanan says, Elamata, if you're going to use this logic, and you're going to say, when it says Chag HaKotzir, it cannot be talking about Shavuos itself. It's got to be talking about the days after Shavuos, right? Because you can't do Ktsira. What about Chag HaOsiv, which is Sukkot, right? Chag HaOsiv. What about Chag HaOsiv, the time of the ingathering, the Yom Tov of the ingathering? So I'm going to ask you the same question. What Yom Tov are you going to say is the Yom Tov where you do the gathering of the crops? You're going to have to say that it's Chag HaSukkos. So then the question is, Amos, when on Sukkot are you going to be doing the gathering of all from the fields? If you're going to say it's on Yom Tov itself, can't be. What malacha be Yom Tov misharing? Are you allowed to do this kind of malacha on Yom Tov? For sure not. Ella, you have to say Ella b'chol shel moed. That when are you going to do the gathering in of all of this crop on Chol HaMoed? And this is going to lead into the next conversation. Chol HaMoed mishari, is it really permitted to do gathering and this kind of labor, this kind of malacha on Chol HaMoed? Certainly not. You're not allowed to do malacha on Chol HaMoed. Ella, Chag haba b'zman ha'osiv. So you're going to come along and say that it's the Chag that is in the time of the gathering, which means to say that when it says Chag HaOsiv, it doesn't mean that Sukkot is actually the day that you do gathering, but rather it is the Yom Tov that falls in the period. It's the Yom Tov that falls in the period of the ingathering. So if that's the case, so then use the same logic back on Shavuos. Hachinami, so too by Shavuos, it's not the Yom Tov on which you do Ktsira itself, but rather it's Chag haba b'zman Ktsira. If so, your whole limud of how you learn Tashlumin is refuted. In other words, it's not really a limud. And we don't respond to this. We don't respond to Rabbi Yochanan's question, right? However, we still leave everything in place because the limud that we had from Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov still stays in place, because there's a hekesh, and the hekesh, it seems Rabbi Yochanan still accepted that when you have the juxtaposition of ukrosem and uvukutzrechem, that he accepted. But this idea of the Chag HaKotzir, right, where it's not a juxtaposition, but you're trying to say that Chag HaKotzir actually refers to the Yom Tov, to the days after Yom Tov itself, that he didn't accept. That drasha he didn't accept. Okay. However, this segues into a whole new discussion, because Miklal, from this whole interaction between Rabbi Yochanan and Rishi Lakish, it's implied that Tarvayus Svirlu, both of them hold the Chol Shel Moed also Basiyas Malacha. That on Chol HaMoed it's forbidden to do Malacha, right? Because again, what was Rabbi Yochanan's question? Rabbi Yochanan's question is that when it says B'Chag HaOsiv, what is this talking about? It's talking about Chag HaSukkos. And when on Chag HaSukkos you can't be on Yom Tov because you're not allowed to do Malacha. So when are you going to say? You're going to say it's Chol HaMoed. But then you come, but Chol HaMoed, are you allowed to do Malacha on Chol HaMoed? Certainly not. Rish Lakish doesn't come back and say yes, you are. So both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish both seem to agree that on Chol HaMoed you're not allowed to do Malacha. Right, the Gemara. How do we know this? How do we know that you cannot do any malacha on Chol Hamoed? Where do we learn this from? And for the Gemara, the Torah, the Rabbanon, the rabbis, Torah, and the Brisa, says as follows. Now, it's going to be a drasha on how to read the verse. The pshat is read one way, but the limud, the drasha that we're going to make, is you read it slightly differently. In other words, you take away the comma. You'll see. It says, Eschag hamatzos tishmor shivas yamim. Now, how do we normally read it? Eschag hamatzos tishmor. You should guard the festival of matzos, comma, shivas yamim, and so on, right? So, but here, the way we're reading it is the Chag HaMatzos you should guard for 7 days. Limeid. So, if you read it this way, this is teaching us al Chol Hamoed on Chol Hamoed she'asu b'asiyas malacha, that you're not allowed to do malacha. These are the words of Rabbi Yeshia. Rabbi Yonasan says, you're bringing a pasuk to tell me that you're not allowed to do malacha on Chol Hamoed. You don't even need a pasuk to tell you you're not allowed to do a malacha on Chol Hamoed. Why? Because I have a kal v'chayma that you can learn it from. What's the kal v'chayma? It's not needed. Why is it not needed? Because kal v'chayma, we can learn it from a kal v'chayma. What's the kal v'chayma? Umar rishon shvi. Now, if the first day and the seventh day, which are called Yomim Tovim, right? And you're not allowed to do any you're not allowed to do any malacha on the first day and the seventh day. Now, what do we see about the first day and the seventh day that is different than the intermediary days, than Chol Hamoed, is she'en kedusha lifneihem ula achareihem. The day before Yom Tov is not holy, and the day after the last day is not holy. And nevertheless, those days themselves, it's forbidden to do any malacha. If you're talking about the days of Chol Hamoed, which do have Yomim Tovim before and after them. You have the first day before the first days of Chol Hamoed, and you have the last day after the last days of Chol Hamoed, right? So you have a kedusha before and after. Certainly, it should be asur. It should be asur to do any malacha on Chol Hamoed. Isn't it logical? Isn't it logical to say that they should certainly be asur to do any malacha? So now, the Gemara says, you know what? I don't like a kal v'chayma. And the reason why, every time you make a kal v'chayma, right, you have to make sure that it's sound across the board. You cannot come and undo it by pointing out a flaw. So here, the Gemara comes and shows a flaw in the kal v'chayma. What's the flaw? He says like this: Sheishis yemei bereishis yechichu. The 6 days of creation, right, will come and refute the kal v'chayma. Why? Because let's look at the 6 days of creation. The 6 days of creation are sandwiched between Shabbos and Shabbos, right? You have the Shabbos before the 6 days, and then you have the Shabbos after. So the 6 days, right, which are the ordinary days of the week, are sandwiched between Kedusha, and nevertheless, we don't make them days that are forbidden to do any work. Right, so let's do it inside. They will, the 6 days of creation, meaning the ordinary days of the week, Sunday through Friday, will refute their reasoning. Yes.
How can he say that for what happened before Bereshit?
That's a good question. So it seems
that's I have a problem with this answer. I mean, I could understand if the day before was something holy, etc. I mean, the day after the 6 days is Shabbat. Okay, he gets that one. But before, where's the proof?
Not before.
So yeah. So for this we need to look into Rashi. It's a good question, but let's look in Rashi. Rashi, when it says Sheishis Yemei Bereishis, he says you shouldn't understand it literally as the 6 days of creation, the original ones, but rather Yemei Kol Shavua or Shavua. it's referring to the 6 days of every single week. They're sitting between two Shabbos. So you're right. If you're going to read it literally as Sheish Yemei Bereishis, then you don't have that argument, because before Sheish Yemei Bereishis, there's no Shabbos really, right?
Rabbi, if he had used the 6 days of
the week, right?
Shavua, I would agree with you 100%.
Right.
But he used a very specific term,
Right.
Sheshet Yemei Bereshit, and that brings up in everyone's mind. There's a very specific thing that comes up in somebody's mind.
No, I agree with you, and I'm going to look into it further after this year as to why it uses specifically this, and not just say Shish Yemei Shavua, where you'd avoid this problem. But for the sake of this year, I'm gonna stick with the way Rashi explains it and see if there's any particular reason why it uses the term Sheish Yemei Bereishis as opposed to Sheish Yemei Shavua, which would have been a lot less problematic. I agree with you. It is strange that it would use Sheish Yemei Bereishis instead of Sheish Yemei Shavua. So I don't know the answer. I'll look into it. Be'ezus Hashem. So they are umutarin basiyas mulacha, that these 6 days of the week are mutar ba'alacha, and so therefore the whole kal v'chomer goes out the window, right? So says the Gemara, no, 1 second. Ma l'sheish yemei bereishis she'em behen karban musaf. I can respond to you and say you cannot compare Sheish Yemei Bereishis to Chol HaMoed. Why? Because Chol HaMoed has something that Sheish Yemei Bereishis doesn't, which is what? The Karban Musaf. You don't bring up a Karban Musaf on any ordinary day of the week. So therefore, since on Chol HaMoed you do bring up a Karban, so I'll say, Toima b'Chol HaMoed sheyesh by Karban Musaf, right? Therefore, I will come along and say that since they're sandwiched between Kedusha before it and Kedusha after it, therefore, I would say you're not allowed to do any malacha. Frank the Gemara, 1 second. I'm going to refute that argument. Why? Because Rosh Chodesh Yichiach. Because at the end of the day, you're right. Ordinary days, right, where you're allowed to do malacha, are not the same as Chol HaMoed. However, Rosh Chodesh, when it falls out during the week, is an ordinary day, and you are allowed to do malacha, even though you bring a Karban Musaf. So Rosh Chodesh Yichiach, Rosh Chodesh will refute this argument that you're trying, refute the refutation. Sheyesh by Karban, Rosh Chodesh Yichiach, Sheyesh by Karban Musaf, it has a Karban Musaf, or Mutar Basiyas Malacha, and you are allowed to do malacha. So, in order to be able to keep the kal v'chomer, we come and say, no. Ma l'Rosh Chodesh, she'ein karu mikra kodesh. Rosh Chodesh is different. You can't use that as a refutation, because Rosh Chodesh is never called mikra kodesh, right? It's time of Chol HaMoed. So let's say that Chol HaMoed shekaru mikra kodesh, that is called a mikra kodesh. Hayel v'karu mikra kodesh, since it's called mikra kodesh, dinhush also basiyas malacha. So therefore, it is a kal v'chomer that you should not be doing malacha on it, because it is preceded and it is followed by 2 days of kedusha, the day of the first day of Yom Tov and the last day of the Yom Tov, and so the kal v'chomer stands in place. So now, the question we had was, how do you know that it's also to do malacha? And we've answered that either you could follow the view of Rabbi Yoshia, that the way we read the pasuk as Chag HaMatzos Tishma Shivas Yomim tells us that even Chol HaMoed is also the malacha, right? It's forbidden to do malacha. Or you could take the kal v'chomer of Rabbi Yonasan, which says that because the first days and the last days are not preceded or followed by holy days, whereas Chol HaMoed is, so it's a kal v'chomer that you shouldn't be able to do malacha on those days. And we will, Lemitz Hashem, pick up from here, Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph, tomorrow, Be'ezus Hashem. Thank you all for joining.
Amen. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you, Rabbi.
No problem. Hatzlacha.
Number 2. Okay.